Claire walked alone through an abandoned village, her feet sinking softly into the dry ground. The sky, tinged with a lifeless pale hue, reflected the very existence she now led. The silence no longer bothered her. She had grown accustomed to this new reality. But unlike almost everyone else, Claire was different. She could still speak, but she kept that gift hidden as though it were a curse. Being discovered would make her a target, hunted by the trackers, those who sought to control the immune. With a knife strapped to her belt and a worn backpack on her shoulders, Claire moved among the ruins, searching for supplies. Every trip to the neighboring village was a calculated risk, but the need for food and water forced her out of the relative safety of her makeshift home. As she sifted through the remains of an old grocery store, something caught her eye: fresh footprints in the dust. Her heart raced. Following the tracks, Claire cautiously approached their source. That's when she saw him. In the middle of a small square, between the shadows of ruined buildings, a man lay on the ground, groaning in pain. He clutched his side, stained with fresh blood. Instinctively, Claire stepped back, her eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of danger. But there was no one else around. She stood frozen for a few seconds, weighing her options. Helping someone in that state was a risk. He could be a tracker or a trap. But the muffled sounds of his suffering compelled her to move closer. "You can talk?" His voice came out in a faint whisper. Claire froze. It was obvious that he, too, was one of the immune dot. Claire hesitated before responding, her eyes still evaluating the man's every movement. "I can," she said, breaking the silence she had imposed on herself for days. "But I don't usually do that." The man coughed, his body trembling. I'm Luke. We need to get out of here. They're following me." Claire's eyes widened at the mention of they. If the trackers were close, it meant they knew about him. And if they knew about him, it was only a matter of time before they found Claire, too. The fear of becoming a target surged through her mind. She knew that helping Luke meant exposing herself, but leaving him there was a death sentence. Without further hesitation, Claire knelt down and, with effort, hoisted Luke's arm over her shoulder. "Come on, get up. We don't have much time." Luke groaned but managed to stand with her help. His legs were weak, and the wound looked deep, but he forced his body to cooperate. The two of them began moving slowly through the square, Claire leading the way back to her home. She kept her senses sharp, every noise, every movement in the horizon a potential sign that the trackers were near. The walk seemed endless. Luke murmured in pain from time to time, and Claire felt his weight increasing on her shoulders. Every passing minute demanded more from her body. When they finally reached Claire's cabin, night was already falling. She helped Luke lie down in a corner, illuminated by the dim light of a flickering lamp. He breathed heavily, his eyes shut tight as he tried to endure the pain. "Thank you," he whispered. "But they're still after us. We're not safe here." Claire handed him a bottle of water, her mind already racing with plans. If Luke was being hunted, it meant the trackers knew there were immune people in the area. And if they knew about him, it was only a matter of time before they found her as well. "We'll rest for a bit," she said, crossing her arms. "But by dawn, we leave." Luke opened his eyes, struggling to focus. "Do you have a place to go?" Claire shook her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the window, where darkness was starting to swallow the landscape outside. "Not yet," she whispered. "But we'll be safer if we keep moving." Slowly, Luke nodded, his eyes closing again, exhausted. Claire, however, knew the rest would be brief. In the oppressive silence of this new reality, danger was always lurking. And with the trackers so close, every second counted. Dawn arrived wrapped in silence, broken only by the occasional murmurs of Luke, who stirred in his fevered sleep. Claire sat by the window, keeping watch. Her mind raced, analyzing the few options she had. What was clear was that they couldn't stay here. If the trackers were indeed in the area, it would only be a matter of time before they found them. Luke woke with a low groan, his face twisted in pain. Claire approached, offering him a small bottle of water, which he accepted gratefully. After a few sips, his breathing began to steady, and he finally managed to meet her gaze with more clarity. "I know this is a lot to ask of you," Luke began, his voice hoarse. "But I'm not alone in this. There's a group, survivors like you and me, working on developing a cure. They need someone who can still speak." Claire frowned, stepping back slightly. The idea of a cure seemed almost fantastical after so long immersed in chaos and destruction. She felt skeptical, yet curious. A cure? How is that possible? Why haven't I heard about them? Luke took a deep breath before responding, the pain evident in every word. "They've been hiding, just like everyone else. They're in a refuge, an old isolated laboratory. But the problem is, they've only gotten so far in their research. They need someone who can still speak to activate a device that might reverse the damage caused by the disease." Claire shook her head, trying to absorb the information. "And why didn't they come for me sooner? If they know there are immune people out there." "Because they didn't know where you were," Luke interrupted, his voice trembling. "I found them by chance while I was trying to survive. And as soon as I mentioned there were rumors of another immune in this region, they sent me to find you. But the trackers followed us. They want to use people like us, control us, to ensure only those who pay for treatment get cured." The weight of the revelation hit Claire. This wasn't just a simple flight through empty fields, it was a race for humanity's survival. The idea that she could be the key to a possible cure filled her with conflict. She had always avoided getting involved with other survivors to ensure her own safety, but now it seemed fate was demanding more from her. Luke leaned forward, his eyes full of sincerity and desperation. "I know it's a lot to ask, but without you, there's no way to finish the work. You're the missing piece." Claire stayed silent for a long moment, digesting the responsibility now thrust upon her. Her instincts screamed to run, as they always had. Staying hidden and surviving alone was all she knew. But the need to do something more began to creep into her heart. "How far are they?" she finally asked, her voice low. Luke nodded. "About 2 days' walk, if we keep up the pace." Claire stood up and began packing her things. If they were going to leave, they had to be ready before the morning light gave them away. "We'll rest a few more hours. Once the sun starts rising, we leave," she said, her voice firm. Luke looked at her, surprised by the quick decision. "You're going to help?" Claire took a deep breath before answering. "I'm not doing it for them," she said, while organizing her backpack. "But maybe it's time to do something for myself. And if there's a chance to stop all of this, I can't ignore it." Luke smiled, relieved, as he settled back down. The weight of uncertainty still hung over them, but for the first time in a long while, Claire felt there was something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Claire and Luke left the cabin, following a narrow path covered with vegetation that snaked deeper into the woods. The air was cold and biting, and the mist rising from the trees veiled the way ahead like a curtain. Luke was still weak, but he kept pace, pressing his hand against the wound that, though bandaged, continued to bleed slightly. Claire knew he wouldn't last long without proper care. The world around them was far too quiet. The silence was almost palpable, broken only by the rustling of leaves beneath their feet. Even for Claire, who had grown used to the solitude of this new world, something felt off about the calm. She constantly looked back, certain they were being followed, but saw nothing beyond the shadows dancing among the trees. They walked for hours, stopping only briefly to hydrate and check the surroundings. The presence of the trackers was almost tangible, an invisible threat, but ever present. Claire felt the weight of their footsteps quicken, the fear that they were closing and growing with every mile. "Have you ever been this far from the city before?" Luke asked, breathless, as he leaned against a tree to rest. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his exhaustion was becoming evident. "A few times," Claire replied, her eyes still scanning the forest. "But always with a purpose. Never just to flee." Luke tried to smile, but the effort of speaking and walking was beginning to take its toll. "Running seems like all we do now." Claire watched him for a moment, feeling a surge of sympathy. She knew what it was like to survive purely on instinct, living day by day with the uncertainty of who was lurking nearby. But now, with him, the situation felt more urgent, as if time itself were running out. And, in a way, it was. That's when Claire noticed it. A quick movement, almost imperceptible, in her peripheral vision. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the trees, her heart racing. "There," she whispered, pointing to the shadow that disappeared between the trunks. Luke tried to lift his head, but he was too exhausted to react quickly. Claire ducked down, pulling him behind the cover of a fallen log. "They've found us," Claire whispered, terror evident in her voice. "The trackers." Luke struggled to get up, but Claire held him down. "Stay low," she ordered. "We need to get out of here without being seen." Moving quickly but cautiously, Claire guided Luke over the uneven terrain, keeping close to the ground. The sound of branches breaking in the distance was the only clue that the trackers were closing in. They knew how to track, and from the sound of it, they were gaining ground. "Running now will alert them," Claire said, forcing Luke to keep crawling along the trail. "We need a distraction." Luke's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. Claire looked around, her eyes searching for something to use to throw off the trackers. That's when she spotted a small hill ahead, where the vegetation was thick enough to cover their movements. "There," she pointed. "If we can make it to that hill, we can hide long enough for them to pass." They crawled toward the hill, Luke's body trembling with exhaustion. Claire could feel the pressure of time weighing down on them. Finally, they reached the base of the hill, where a thick area of ferns and dense shrubs offered some protection. They hid there, panting, as the sound of the trackers grew closer and closer. Time seemed to stretch, their hearts beating in unison with the footsteps closing in from all sides. Claire gripped the knife in her hand, ready to fight if necessary. Luke could barely keep his eyes open, his breathing ragged and uneven. The trackers finally appeared, moving with precision through the trees. Claire watched them through the leaves, counting at least 4 men, all armed and with fierce looks on their faces. Their steps were calculated, and they whispered to each other in inaudible tones. Claire held her breath, praying they would pass by. For a moment, the leader of the group stopped, raising his hand to signal silence. Claire felt her heart stop. He looked in the direction of the hill where they were hiding, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see through the foliage. Claire gripped Luke's arm tightly, silently ordering him not to move. The tracker continued to stare for a few seconds but finally shrugged and moved on. When the last of them disappeared down the trail, Claire exhaled, relief flooding her body. "They're gone," she whispered, helping Luke sit up properly. "But they'll be back. We need to move quickly." Luke nodded weakly, and together they began descending the hill, more cautious than ever. The feeling that every step they took increased the danger kept them on edge. The only certainty was that this would be a long chase, and they were still far from any safe haven. The journey to the refuge was grueling and unforgiving. Luke could barely stand by the time they saw, in the distance, what appeared to be an abandoned complex in the middle of the forest. The weathered concrete walls were partially covered in vegetation, as if nature were trying to swallow the place whole. To an untrained eye, it would easily go unnoticed, but Claire knew they were close. "This is it?" Claire asked, her eyes fixed on the building ahead, her breathing still heavy from the escape. Luke nodded slowly, panting. "Yeah. This is it. The lab. The refuge." He clutched his wound, which had worsened since they left their initial hiding spot. "We need to get inside before. I can't last much longer." Claire helped him lean against a tree while she scouted the entrance. There were no signs of life. No sound, no movement. Just the faint breeze rustling the trees and the crunch of dry leaves beneath their feet. She hesitated for a moment, carefully analyzing the place. "Are you sure they're here?" she asked, still suspicious. Before Luke could respond, a side door to the complex creaked open slowly. Claire instinctively reached for her knife but relaxed when she saw two figures emerge. A man and a woman, both wearing simple, worn-out clothes, but the relief in their faces was undeniable as they saw Luke. "Luke! We heard you coming," said the man, rushing over to him. "Looks like you had a long journey." "Longer than expected," Luke replied, his voice weak. He gestured toward Claire. "This is Claire. She's the one who can help us finish the work." The man turned to Claire, assessing her with an intense look. "I'm Dr. Scott," he said, extending his hand. "And this is Megan, my assistant. We've been waiting for you for a long time." Claire shook his hand, though still cautious. "Luke said you need me to finish a cure. But he also mentioned we're being hunted. I need to know what's really going on." Dr. Scott nodded, his face darkening with seriousness. "You're right to be cautious. Come inside, we have much to discuss." Claire helped Luke to his feet, and the group entered the complex. Inside, the lab looked even more deteriorated. Old equipment was piled against the walls, and some lights flickered weakly, powered by noisy generators. The place felt like a battleground between time and survival. Yet, despite the poor conditions, Claire could sense that this place still held hope. They led Luke to a back room, where Megan quickly began tending to him. Dr. Scott led Claire to an improvised meeting room. Sitting around a small table, he began explaining. "This disease that destroyed the world started here," he said, his tone heavy with guilt. Claire raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Here? You created it?" Dr. Scott sighed deeply, nodding. "Yes, but not intentionally. We were trying to develop a way to enhance neural communication between people. Something that could revolutionize science and medicine. But something went horribly wrong. Instead of improving neural connections, the experiment destroyed people's ability to speak. And once the first case spread, it was impossible to contain." Claire felt a chill run down her spine as she heard the truth. The global disaster that had turned the world silent and chaotic had been caused by a scientific error. "And how exactly can I help fix this?" Dr. Scott looked at her, his eyes tired but determined. "We developed a device that can reverse the neurological damage caused by the disease. But to activate it, we need someone who can still speak. The process requires verbal commands to re-trigger the brain's connection to speech. So why not use any other immune person?" Claire asked, still suspicious. "I'm not the only one." Scott shook his head. "You're special, Claire. From what we've been able to discover, you have a unique neurological pattern. Something in your genetics allows you not only to survive the disease but to activate the healing mechanisms. The other immune, unfortunately, don't have the same ability. Claire's suspicion grew. Something about the way he spoke made her feel they weren't being completely transparent. However, before she could question him further, the door opened and Megan entered, her face tensed up. "The trackers are closing in," she announced quickly. "We need to prepare. We don't have much time." Claire looked at Scott, her heart racing. "How long until the device is ready?" Scott hesitated. "We need a few more hours. But we can activate it if you help us operate the system." Claire knew those few hours could mean the difference between life and death. The danger was fast approaching, and now everything depended on her dot. "Okay," she said, resolutely. "Show me what to do." The refuge, which had briefly offered safety, was now becoming a trap. And Claire knew that a confrontation with the trackers was inevitable. The atmosphere inside the refuge was thick with tension, like the air before an impending storm, and Claire could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her. As she left the room where the device was, she found Megan and other survivors rushing around, setting up makeshift barricades. The trackers' approach was no longer a distant threat, they were here, about to storm the building. Claire looked at Megan, who was busy stacking boxes against the doors. "How many?" Megan lifted her head, her face pale with worry. "Several, maybe 10, maybe more. And they're armed. We don't have much time." A claustrophobic sensation gripped Claire's chest. She knew the trackers wouldn't show mercy. Capturing immune people was more valuable to them than anything else, and Claire, with her unique ability, would be a prize beyond measure. But she still hadn't decided if she trusted Dr. Scott enough to risk her life with the device. The idea that they were willing to sacrifice her without knowing for sure if it would work continued to echo in her mind. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire rang out from outside, followed by a muffled scream. Claire ran to the nearest window, peeking through the cracks. There they were, the trackers. They moved through the forest with military precision, their weapons raised toward the refuge. On the horizon, a thin line of smoke rose, signaling that they had set something ablaze to divert attention or encircle the area. Panic began to spread among the survivors, and Claire knew that if they didn't act quickly, the refuge would be overrun. "We need to get out of here," she said to Megan, who stood beside her, clearly in shock from what she saw. "If we stay here, we're dead." Megan seemed torn. "What about Dr. Scott? He said the device is almost ready. And if you activate it?" "If I activate it, I might die." "Or maybe the device won't work," Claire snapped, frustrated. "And if the trackers break in before the machine's ready, it won't matter what I do." The sounds of heavy footsteps and the crack of gunfire grew closer. Megan looked at Claire desperately, hoping she'd make the right decision. Just then, Luke, still visibly injured, staggered into the corridor. "Claire," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Scott says it's ready. He just needs you now." Claire felt a wave of pressure crash over her. Everyone in the refuge's fate depended on her decision. But the growing sound of the tracker's approach made her choice seem more immediate. There was no time to hesitate. "Let's go, then," she said finally, feeling the weight of her words. "If I'm going to do this, I need protection until the device is activated. Megan, Luke, you have to help keep the trackers away." Megan and Luke both nodded, knowing this was their last chance at defense. Megan quickly began organizing the other survivors, distributing makeshift weapons and preparing barricades at the main entrance. Luke, despite his weakened state, grabbed a rusted pistol from one of the cabinets and moved toward the door, where the first rounds were already starting to hit. Claire ran back to the lab, where Dr. Scott was waiting beside the machine. "Is it ready?" she asked, her voice firm but anxious. Scott nodded, adjusting some buttons on the device's screen. "All you need to do is follow the instructions on the screen and give the verbal commands. Once you activate the process, the system will begin working to restore the neural connections." The sound of explosions and the crack of bullets against the walls echoed down the corridor. The trackers were breaking in. Claire looked at the machine in front of her, her heart pounding. She knew this could be the end, for her, and for everyone there. But she also knew that if she did nothing, the outcome would be the same. "I'm ready," she said, taking a deep breath and positioning herself in front of the screen. Scott stood beside her, pressing a few commands on the keyboard. "Now, read the instructions aloud. They will activate the process." Claire began reading, her voice echoing through the lab as the words filled the air. The machine responded with blinking lights and mechanical sounds as the system started up. Sweat dripped down her forehead. Every command she spoke felt like a step deeper into an unknown abyss. Suddenly, a deafening crash. The door was kicked in. Claire turned quickly. The trackers had entered the lab. "Scott! What do I do now?" Claire shouted, trying to focus as the sound of gunfire filled the air. "Keep going, Claire! You're almost there," he shouted back, trying to block the trackers with a piece of metal. Claire could barely hear herself over the chaos. She knew this was the decisive moment. Either she completed the process, or everything would be lost. With the trackers storming in, time was running out. She took a deep breath and said the final command. The moment Claire spoke the final command, the device hummed loudly, as if it had come to life on its own. Lights flickered, and the sound of machines working filled the lab. The air around her seemed to vibrate, as though something was about to happen. Claire felt a sudden warmth rise through her body, and her heart raced. It was as if an invisible force was moving within her, something she couldn't control. Dr. Scott watched intently, his eyes fixed on the machine and on Claire, as though time had stopped. Outside, the sound of gunfire still echoed, and the fight between the survivors and the trackers continued. But inside the lab, everything hinged on that moment, on that act of courage and sacrifice. "It's working," Scott murmured, as if trying to convince himself. Claire, however, could barely hear him. Her vision was blurring, and the heat inside her body intensified with every second. She felt her muscles tense, her entire body trembling. The world around her began to spin, and for a brief instant, she thought she might faint. Suddenly, everything stopped. The heat vanished, and the machine's hum ceased. The lab fell silent, as though all sound had been sucked into the device. Claire slowly opened her eyes, realizing she was still standing. The dizziness passed, but something inside her had changed. "Are you okay?" Dr. Scott asked, cautiously approaching her. Claire nodded, still trying to process what had just happened. "Yes. I think so." She touched her forehead, where the sweat was beginning to dry. She felt drained, but alive. Before she could say anything more, a metallic clatter echoed through the lab. Claire turned sharply, seeing the door being broken down. 2 trackers entered, armed and with predatory looks in their eyes. Panic filled the room. They wouldn't waste time capturing or killing anyone in their way. "Scott, get out of here!" Claire shouted, running toward the scientist. But it was too late. One of the trackers fired, and Scott fell to the floor, his body lifeless before it hit the cold tiles. Claire froze for a moment, the shock of seeing him die in front of her paralyzing her. But there was no time to mourn. The trackers were closing in, and Claire knew she was their next target. She looked around frantically, trying to find a way out. That's when she felt something different. Her head felt strangely light, and an odd sensation filled her mind. It was as if she were connected to something. Then the voice came. A voice, clear and distinct, sounded inside her mind. "Claire, are you there?" She turned, confused, searching for the source of the voice, but no one was speaking. And then she realized the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. It was Megan. "Claire, can you hear me? Something's happened. I can talk to you, but without talking." Claire froze for a second, feeling a wave of understanding wash over her. The device had worked, but not in the way they expected. People hadn't regained speech in the traditional sense. They were communicating telepathically, linked directly to Claire's mind. "Megan?" Claire responded mentally, still trying to comprehend what was happening. "How?" "I don't know," Megan replied, her voice soft in Claire's mind. "But something in you activated this connection. All of US survivors, we're connected to you now." Claire could hardly believe what she was hearing, but there was no time to think. The trackers were advancing, ready to finish it all. Now, she had a choice: continue running, or use this new ability to fight. "What do I do?" Claire asked, her mind racing in 1,000 directions. "Use it," Megan said. "You're the key now. They can't touch us if we're united. Command us, Claire." Led. Claire felt the weight of responsibility once again, but now with a new strength inside her. Closing her eyes for a moment, she focused on the minds of the other survivors. A wave of silent communication rippled through the lab, like an invisible current of understanding. All together, she thought, sending the command to Megan and the others. "We fight." And, for the first time, Claire wasn't alone. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. The trackers, unprepared to face an enemy that seemed to act as one, were caught off guard. The survivors, guided by their new telepathic connection to Claire, reacted with precision and coordination. There were no words, only action. Every move seemed orchestrated, as if they were one body, moved by the same invisible force. Claire, feeling the weight of the connection to all the survivors around her, maintained control. She could feel their fear, their courage, and their hope pulsing through their minds. The telepathic unity they shared proved to be a powerful weapon, and the trackers soon realized they were at a disadvantage. One by one, they were taken down, unable to keep up with the speed and precision of the coordinated attacks. When the last tracker fell, a silence settled over the environment. But this time, it wasn't the oppressive, lonely silence that Claire had known for so long. It was a silence filled with meaning, brimming with a new form of communication. The survivors looked at each other, breathing heavily, but they knew that, somehow, they were all connected. Claire collapsed to the ground, exhausted, feeling the weight of so many minds bearing down on hers. The sensation of being linked to so many people at once was overwhelming. Every thought, every emotion, flowed into her consciousness. For a moment, she feared she might lose control, that her own identity would be diluted in the stream of others' thoughts. "Claire, are you okay?" Megan's voice sounded in her mind, full of concern. Claire struggled to focus, trying to keep her own voice above the others. "I'm trying. It's too much. I don't know if I can keep this up." Megan approached, kneeling beside her. "You don't have to do it alone. We're all connected, yes, but you don't need to carry it all." Let us share the burden. Claire took a deep breath, trying to relax. She felt the minds of the others pull back slightly, giving her space. The pressure eased, and slowly, she began to feel more in control. The new form of communication was powerful, but also dangerous if not managed carefully. What happens now? Luke asked, his voice clear in everyone's minds. He had stood up, still injured, but determined to keep going. Claire looked at him, then at the others around her. Now, we rebuild. They didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but they knew the world had changed forever. Speech, as they had known it, might never return, but the telepathic connection they now shared was a new form of unity. What remained of humanity might find a way to survive and, perhaps, thrive again. Days later, as she walked through the desolate fields, Claire heard a new voice in her mind. It was weak, distant, but clear enough to be understood. Claire, can you hear me? A child's voice, full of hope. She stopped, looking toward the horizon. A child, immune and connected, lost somewhere, but alive. Claire's mission wasn't over yet. Yes, she replied mentally. I'm coming.